April 1945. A POW processing center outside Frankfurt, Germany. The war was crumbling into its final days, and General George S. Patton was walking through rows of surrendering German soldiers when he stopped cold. His eyes locked onto something that made his blood freeze. An SS officer stood in the line, head held high, and around his neck hung a chain. Not one dog tag, not two. 50 American dog tags strung together like a butcher's necklace catching the spring sunlight, each one stamped with the name of a dead American boy. 50 mothers who would never see their sons again. 50 fathers who would never shake their boys' hands. 50 families destroyed, reduced to pieces of metal, hanging from a murderer's throat. And the German was smiling. Patton stared at that necklace, and what he did next, what he said next, would echo through military history for the next 80 years. Because Patton didn't just see a prisoner, he saw something darker, something that demanded a reckoning. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next gripping episodes. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Become part of our community of history lovers today. The man who would expose this monster wasn't a famous officer. He was Captain James Mitchell, a 32-year-old paperwork officer from a small town in Ohio. A nobody. A man who processed forms, checked names, and stamped documents. But on this day, James Mitchell would stand beside the most feared general in the U.S. Army and witness something so disturbing it would haunt him for the rest of his life. Within 90 minutes, 50 names would be cataloged. Within weeks, an investigation would uncover 47 war crimes. Within 2 years, a death sentence would be carried out. And it all started because one Ohio captain failed to look at a prisoner's neck. This is the story they tried to bury. To understand what happened that April morning, you have to understand the chaos engulfing Germany in the spring of 1945. The Third Reich was collapsing. The Russians were grinding through Berlin from the east. The Americans, British, and French were sweeping through the west. Adolf Hitler was hiding in his bunker. German cities were rubble. German soldiers were surrendering by the thousands every single day, sometimes 10,000 in a single afternoon, overwhelming American processing centers across the country. And in that flood of surrendering soldiers, something terrible was hiding. The Waffen-SS, the fanatics, the true believers. Men who had committed atrocities across Europe for 6 years and now hoped to disappear into the crowd of ordinary Wehrmacht prisoners. They stripped off their distinctive uniforms. They cut off their tattoos. They lied about their units. Some succeeded in escaping justice for decades, but not all of them. The Frankfurt Processing Center handled around 1,200 prisoners per day. Captain James Mitchell ran the intake desk with 2 young corporals, Tommy Hayes from Pennsylvania and Frank DeLuca from Brooklyn. Both were 19 years old. Both had been processing prisoners for less than 2 months. Their job was simple. Take the weapons, record the names, check for SS tattoos under the left arm, file the paperwork, move them to the holding pens. What they were not trained to do was inspect every prisoner for jewelry. By April 1945, the Americans had documented thousands of cases of war crimes by SS units, massacres at Malmedy, executions of POWs in the Ardennes, wounded American soldiers shot in their hospital beds during the Battle of the Bulge, civilians butchered in French and Belgian villages. The evidence was mounting, but the criminals were vanishing into the chaos. Patton himself had grown obsessed with this problem. He believed every SS murderer who escaped was a personal failure of the United States Army. He told his staff that justice for the dead was as important as victory for the living. That's why he was at the Frankfurt Center that morning, not for inspection, for hunting. But nothing could prepare him for what walked through Mitchell's intake line at 9:47 a.m. His name was Klaus Richter, SS Hauptsturmführer, Captain rank, 12th SS Panzer Division. Hitlerjugend, the most notorious unit in the entire German military, the same unit that had executed Canadian prisoners at the Abbey d'Ardennes in Normandy, the same unit that had massacred civilians in dozens of French villages. Richter was 31 years old, 6 feet tall, blue eyes, blonde hair. the Nazi propaganda ideal made flesh, and he had walked into the processing center wearing a clean uniform, a calm expression, and a souvenir. That souvenir was about to change everything. Tommy Hayes processed Richter first. He took his pistol, recorded his name, checked his SS tattoo, moved him forward. He never looked at Richter's neck because Richter's collar was buttoned high, hiding the chain. Frank DeLuca took his paperwork next. He stamped the form. He didn't look up. Routine. Mechanical. 1,200 prisoners a day made you stop seeing faces. Then Patton walked in. Patton had a sixth sense for trouble. Soldiers who served under him swore he could smell a coward from across a parade ground and a hero from across a battlefield. That morning, walking past row after row of surrendering Germans, his eyes swept across Richter and stopped. Something was wrong. Something glinted at the man's collar. A piece of metal. 2 pieces. More. Patton stepped closer. Closer still. 3 feet away. Then he saw it. The general of the Third Army. The man who had crushed Rommel in Africa, who had liberated Sicily, who had raced across France faster than any commander in modern military history, the legend himself stood frozen in front of an SS captain wearing a necklace of dead Americans. Patton's first instinct was disbelief. He counted them. 1, 2, 5, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. 50 stamped pieces of metal. 50 American names. 50 service numbers. 50 blood types. 50 religions, Protestant or Catholic or Jewish, etched into aluminum. Patton didn't shout. He didn't curse. He didn't draw his famous ivory-handled revolver. He did something far more dangerous. He went quiet. The men who served under Patton knew that quiet was the most terrifying sound in his arsenal. When Patton yelled, "You got chewed out." When Patton went silent, somebody was about to face consequences they would never recover from. Captain Mitchell, standing 30 feet away, saw the general's face change and felt his stomach drop. Whatever was happening, it was bad. Mitchell hurried over. Patton turned to him slowly. His voice was soft, almost gentle, the kind of voice a father uses before delivering punishment. "Captain, how long has this prisoner been in your line?" Mitchell looked at Richter. He looked at the necklace. The world tilted sideways. He understood in one horrifying instant what he was seeing. His mouth went dry. His mind raced through every excuse, every explanation, every defense. None of them worked. "About 10 minutes, sir," he managed, "and nobody noticed his decorations." Mitchell glanced at Hayes and DeLuca, both now staring in horror. He turned back to Patton. "Sir, we didn't see it. The collar." Patton nodded once. He understood. He wasn't going to punish Mitchell. There was a bigger fish to fry, and Patton was a hunter who had just spotted the target of a lifetime. "Get me Lieutenant Harper, and get me a German translator, right now." Mitchell sprinted. Within 2 minutes, he returned with Lieutenant William Harper, the camp's intelligence officer, a sharp-eyed 28-year-old from Connecticut, and Private Anton Weber, a German-American translator born in Munich, who had emigrated to Wisconsin as a child. Weber spoke flawless German with a Bavarian accent. He had been waiting for a moment like this his entire life. When Harper saw the necklace, he whispered 3 words that summed up the feelings of every American present. "Jesus Christ, 50. Patton turned to Weber. His voice was still that terrible, quiet calm. "Ask him his name." Weber spoke in German. Richter answered without hesitation, almost proud, his chin lifted. "Sir, his name is Klaus Richter, SS Hauptsturmführer, Captain, 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend." Patton's jaw tightened. The Hitlerjugend Division. He knew the name. Every American officer knew the name. War crimes investigators had been hunting these men for 10 months. Now one of them was standing in front of him, wearing the names of 50 dead boys around his neck like a trophy hunter wears antlers. "Ask him where he got those tags." Weber translated. Richter answered in clipped German, casual conversational, the way a man might describe collecting stamps. Weber's face hardened as he listened. When he turned back to Patton, his voice was tight with controlled rage. "Sir, he says he collected them from battlefields over the past year. France, Belgium, the Hurtgen Forest. He says he took them from the bodies of soldiers he killed." The processing center had gone dead silent. Every American GI within hearing distance had stopped working. Hands frozen mid-stamp. Pens hovering over paperwork. 200 soldiers staring at one SS captain. "Ask him," Patton said slowly, "why he wears them around his neck." Weber asked. Richter smiled. He gave a small shrug, said something brief, and waited for the translation with the satisfied air of a man explaining an obvious truth. Weber's hands were shaking now. He looked at Patton, and for a moment he couldn't speak. "Private Weber, translate." Weber forced the words out. "Sir, he says they are proof of his kills. He says each tag represents an American soldier he personally killed. He says he is proud of every single one." The silence in that processing center became something physical. A weight. A pressure. 200 American soldiers had just heard a Nazi captain brag about murdering 50 of their brothers, and he was wearing the proof around his neck. Patton stepped closer to Richter. 2 feet away now, then 1. He spoke 5 words. "Take it off, right now." Weber translated. And what Klaus Richter said next would unleash a fury inside George S. Patton that not even his closest aides had ever witnessed. Because Richter looked the most feared general of the Second World War directly in the eyes, and through a slow mocking smile, he answered with 2 words in perfect German. 9. Niemals. No. Never. In Part 2, you'll witness what George S. Patton did when an SS captain refused to surrender his trophies. You'll learn the shocking truth investigators uncovered when they cross-referenced the 50 names, dates, and locations, a discovery so dark, it changed the entire War Crimes Tribunal. You'll meet the Boston mother who finally learned what happened to her missing son. And you'll hear the final words Klaus Richter screamed before American MPs ripped the chain from his throat. The story is only beginning. The reckoning is about to start. April 1945, Frankfurt Processing Center. 10 minutes earlier, General George S. Patton had discovered SS Captain Klaus Richter wearing a necklace of 50 American dog tags, 50 stolen identities of dead American boys. Patton had given a simple order, "Take it off." And Klaus Richter, looking the most feared general of World War II directly in the eye, had answered with 2 words. 9. Niemals. No, never. What happened in the next 90 seconds would become one of the most disturbing confrontations of the entire war, because Patton was about to discover something far darker than a single arrogant prisoner. He was about to uncover a conspiracy of silence that stretched from a Frankfurt camp all the way to Washington, D.C., a system designed to let men like Richter vanish into the chaos of post-war Europe. 300,000 SS members were being processed across the Western Front. Investigators believed up to 40,000 of them were direct war criminals. And the United States Army had no plan, no protocol, and no political will to prosecute even half of them. And this is where everything got worse. Patton turned to Lieutenant William Harper, the camp's intelligence officer, and gave a quiet command. "Get me Colonel Howard Mathers, now." Mathers was the camp commandant, a career officer, 46 years old. 46. A man who had spent the war pushing paperwork in safe rear positions, while soldiers like the ones whose names hung from Richter's neck had bled out in frozen forests. Mathers arrived within 4 minutes, red-faced, breathing hard, already irritated at being summoned away from his morning coffee. He took one look at the necklace and made the worst decision of his career. "General, with respect, we need to follow Geneva Convention protocols. We can't simply confiscate personal items from prisoners without proper documentation. There are procedures." The processing center went silent again. 200 American soldiers had just heard a colonel defend a Nazi murderer's right to wear American dog tags. Patton's eyes narrowed. "Colonel, are you telling me that 50 stolen identities of dead American soldiers are personal property of the man who killed them?" Mathers tried to backtrack. "Sir, I'm only saying we need a formal review. War Department guidelines state that contested items must be cataloged through proper channels before confiscation. If we deviate, defense lawyers at any future tribunal could... Defense lawyers. Patton repeated the words like they tasted of poison. Mathers nodded nervously. Sir, I'm thinking ahead. Bigger picture. We've been told, from Washington, not to create incidents, not to provoke. The political situation is delicate. He lowered his voice. There are people who don't want every SS officer prosecuted. There are men we may need. After the war. Engineers. Scientists. Officers who fought the Russians. This was the dirty secret of April 1945. The Cold War was already starting before the Hot War had ended. American intelligence services had begun quietly identifying German officers, scientists, and SS personnel who could be useful against the Soviet Union. Operation Paperclip would formalize this within a year. But in spring 1945, it was already happening on the ground. Useful Germans were quietly disappearing from prosecution lists. Inconvenient evidence was being filed and forgotten. And men like Mathers, ambitious bureaucrats with an eye on post-war promotions, were carrying water for the politicians. Patton understood all of this. Patton despised all of this. And Patton had built his entire career on doing the right thing at the wrong moment. Colonel Mathers, you are relieved of command of this facility. Effective immediately. Captain Mitchell will assume temporary command. Lieutenant Harper will report directly to my 3rd Army staff for the duration of this investigation. Do I make myself clear? Mathers went pale. Sir, you can't simply... I just did. Get out of my sight. But he found an unexpected ally. 2 days later, Patton walked into a 3rd Army Field Headquarters meeting and discovered that someone had been listening. His name was Brigadier General Telford Taylor, a brilliant Harvard-trained lawyer who would soon become the chief American prosecutor at the Nuremberg subsequent trials. Taylor had heard about Frankfurt. Taylor was furious. And Taylor had a plan. Taylor explained it in 8 minutes flat. The Army was burying SS war crimes cases because individual processing centers had no investigative resources, no legal authority, and no political backing. Patton's discovery of Richter was a gift. 50 dog tags. 50 potential murders. A single defendant who had publicly bragged about his kills. If they could prove just 10 of those killings were war crimes rather than legitimate combat deaths, they would have a textbook case to set the legal precedent for hundreds of future prosecutions. The condition was brutal. They had to do it fast. The Army was already drafting amnesty proposals for low-ranking SS members. Within 60 days, Taylor estimated half of Richter's potential witnesses would be discharged, scattered untraceable. They had one shot. One investigation. One trial. Patton agreed within 30 seconds. The official investigation began on April 18, 1945. Lieutenant Harper was given command of a 12-man team, including investigators, translators, forensic specialists, and 2 field-experienced JAG officers. They were given 6 weeks. Their mission cross-reference all 50 dog tags against unit records, locations, dates, and witness statements. Determine which deaths were combat, which were murder. The day the verification began, every American officer above the rank of major in the European theater was watching. If Patton failed, no SS war criminal below the rank of general would ever face an American court. Harper set up his command post in a captured Wehrmacht barracks outside Frankfurt. The 50 dog tags were laid out on a long oak table, each one tagged, photographed, numbered. The first task was simple but staggering. Each name had to be matched to a specific American soldier. Each soldier had to be located in Army death records. Each death had to be matched to a date, a location, a unit. Then those locations and dates had to be cross-referenced with the movement logs of the 12th SS Panzer Division. It took 11 days of non-stop work. Harper's team identified all 50 soldiers. 43 were confirmed killed in action between June 1944 and February 1945. 7 were listed as missing in action, presumed dead. The locations matched perfectly with the documented combat zones of the 12th SS Panzer Division. So far, Richter's story of legitimate battlefield kills was holding up. Then came the witness interviews. Harper's team tracked down 173 American veterans who had served in or near the units that lost the 50 soldiers. They tracked down 41 captured Wehrmacht prisoners who had served alongside Richter's unit. They tracked down 19 French and Belgian civilians who had witnessed combat in the relevant areas. The interviews were conducted in Frankfurt, Paris, London, and 3 different American hospitals where wounded veterans were still recovering. The results shattered Richter's defense. Of the 50 dog tags, only 12 belonged to soldiers killed in legitimate combat against an armed opponent. The other 38 told a much darker story. 7 were taken from American soldiers, killed during attempted surrender, hands raised weapons, dropped gunned down anyway. 11 were taken from wounded American soldiers found in field aid stations, men too injured to fight executed where they lay. 9 were taken from American prisoners of war who had been held overnight by Richter's unit and then shot in groups before the unit moved out at dawn. The remaining 11 could not be conclusively determined. The witnesses were dead, the records destroyed. 38 murders. Documented. Verified. Witnesses willing to testify. When Harper presented the findings to Patton on May 30, 1945, the general read every page in silence. Then he set the report down, looked Harper in the eye and said 5 words. "Charge him with all 50. Harper hesitated. "Sir, we can only prove 38 beyond reasonable doubt." "Then prove the rest in court. He wore them. He claimed them. Let him explain each one to the families." The case went to trial in 1946. But scaling up was a nightmare. Patton's team wasn't just prosecuting one man. They were trying to use Richter as the legal template for thousands of future cases. That meant every procedural detail had to be perfect. Chain of custody for every dog tag. Sworn affidavits from every witness. Forensic verification of every signature on every document. Translators for every German testimony. Each piece of evidence had to survive the scrutiny of defense lawyers who were already arguing that battlefield collection of identification was an ancient military tradition, not a war crime. Other SS commanders fought back hard. Through quiet channels, through political contacts, through anonymous letters to American politicians, they tried to bury the case. 3 witnesses Harper had identified died under suspicious circumstances before they could testify. 2 American officers who had supported the prosecution were transferred to remote postings in the Pacific. A Frankfurt newspaper secretly funded by old Nazi networks ran articles questioning whether Richter had been mistreated in custody. The first court tests were not in Germany, but in newspapers, congressional offices, and army headquarters across America. Public opinion mattered. Patton knew it. He gave 7 private interviews to journalists he trusted, never on the record, always pushing the same message. 50 dog tags, 50 American boys, 50 families waiting for answers. The trial wasn't about one Nazi. It was about whether the United States cared enough about its dead sons to demand justice for them. The first families received their dog tags back in October 1945, 4 months before the trial began. Mrs. Margaret Murphy of Boston opened her front door on a cold Tuesday morning. An army officer stood on her porch, holding a small velvet bag. Inside was a single dog tag stamped with the name of her son David, 22 years old, killed in Belgium in December 1944. For 10 months, she had not known if he was dead captured or hiding wounded somewhere in Europe. Now she knew. Her son had been one of the 11 killed at the field hospital executed in his hospital bed by Klaus Richter's unit. Mrs. Murphy held the tag against her chest and wept for 40 minutes on her front porch. 23 families like hers were notified in the first round. What none of them knew was that another conflict was brewing thousands of miles away in a Soviet sector of Berlin, where Russian intelligence officers had just taken custody of 3 Wehrmacht generals who had served alongside Richter. The Soviets had their own list, their own evidence, their own demands. And what they were about to bring to the Allied table would hijack the Richter case in ways no American prosecutor could have predicted, because the Russians had captured something the Americans did not know existed. A leather-bound ledger, handwritten, in Klaus Richter's own handwriting, documenting not 50 murders, but 206. In Part 3, you will discover what was inside the Soviet ledger. You will witness the diplomatic crisis that erupted when Stalin demanded Richter be transferred to Moscow for trial. You will meet the American interrogator who broke Richter in a 6-hour confrontation that left an SS captain weeping on a concrete floor. And you will learn the explosive secret Patton himself uncovered a secret that linked Klaus Richter to a network of war criminals reaching all the way to Berlin's bunker. The trial was about to become something else entirely. The reckoning was about to go global, and the real war for justice was just beginning. April to October 1945, Frankfurt, Germany. What began as a single-chance encounter between General Patton and an arrogant SS captain had grown into something massive. 50 dog tags, an investigation, a legal precedent, and now a Soviet ledger documenting 206 murders in Klaus Richter's own handwriting. The case had stopped being about one man. It had become a global reckoning. And the moment that ledger arrived in American hands, the entire SS war crimes network felt the ground shake beneath them. Within 72 hours, 4 senior SS officers in 3 different POW camps committed suicide. 11 more disappeared from custody, almost certainly with help from inside sympathizers. 2 American intelligence officers received anonymous death threats delivered to their personal quarters. The hunt was on, and the hunted were panicking. And now, this was no longer an investigation. This was war. The Soviet ledger arrived in the Frankfurt prosecutor's office on June 14, 1945, hand-delivered by a Russian colonel named Pyotr Volkov, a man with 3 combat decorations, and the cold eyes of someone who had seen too much. The book was leather-bound, 340 pages written in meticulous German script. Klaus Richter had recorded every kill, names where he knew them, locations where he didn't, dates, methods, sometimes even small drawings. When American investigators saw the contents, 2 of them walked out of the room and vomited. The numbers were staggering. 206 confirmed killings between September 1939 and February 1945. 87 were Soviet soldiers and civilians on the Eastern Front. 42 were Polish civilians, mostly women and children, executed during reprisal operations in 1942. 31 were French resistance members and suspected sympathizers. 19 were Belgian civilians killed during the Ardennes offensive. 27 were American soldiers, the same 50 Patton had discovered minus reused entries. The German High Command's response was immediate. Surviving SS networks, even with the war ending, mobilized with terrifying speed. Forged passports began appearing across southern Germany. Catholic monasteries in Austria and Italy started receiving men with shaved heads and false identification. The infamous rat lines that would smuggle thousands of war criminals to South America in the coming years were already operational. Klaus Richter had become a problem they needed to erase before he talked. On June 28, 1945, an assassination attempt was made inside the Frankfurt detention facility. A Wehrmacht prisoner being processed for release stabbed Richter twice in the abdomen with a sharpened spoon. Richter survived. The attacker was identified as a former Gestapo officer who had bribed his way into transit. American security around Richter doubled, then tripled. He was moved to a sealed cell with 24-hour armed watch. The Germans had revealed something important. They were afraid of what Richter knew. But this was not the only crisis. The American case began collapsing under its own weight. Lieutenant Harper's investigation team had grown from 12 men to 47, then to 83. Witness statements piled up by the thousand. Translation backlogs reached 6 weeks. 3 different American legal frameworks, the Army Field Manual, the Geneva Convention, and the new Nuremberg Charter, contradicted each other on critical procedural questions. Defense lawyers paid for through anonymous Swiss bank accounts began filing motions designed to drown the case in paperwork. Then came the political assault. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, an isolationist with influential donors among German-American business circles, gave a speech on the Senate floor, questioning whether American soldiers should be conducting trials for crimes that had occurred outside American territory. 3 Midwestern newspapers picked up the line. A small but loud political movement began arguing that Richter's case was vengeance, not justice. Patton received private letters from 2 senators urging him to wind down the investigation. He burned them in his office fireplace. Then on July 19, 1945, disaster struck inside the prosecution itself. A junior translator, Corporal Adam Hessler, was discovered to have been altering witness statements. He had been a refugee from a Berlin neighborhood with deep Nazi connections. His family in the American zone had been receiving threatening letters, and he had cracked. 23 sworn statements had to be retranslated. Defense lawyers seized on the discovery and demanded the entire case be thrown out. For 3 terrifying days, it looked like the SS network might actually win. Patton himself was being blamed. Whispers in Washington suggested the famous general had let his anger override his judgment. Eisenhower called him personally and asked in careful words whether the case could survive scrutiny. Patton answered with 3 words: "It will survive." But then a single battle changed everything. The battle wasn't fought with guns. It was fought in a courtroom. The date was October 17, 1945. The location was the Palace of Justice Nuremberg. The case being heard was a procedural test case, not Richter's main trial yet, but a preliminary hearing on the admissibility of the Soviet ledger as evidence. If the ledger was admitted, Richter was finished. If it was rejected, the entire 206-victim case collapsed back into the original 50 dog tags, and even those were under attack. Every senior SS defense lawyer in Europe was watching. The American prosecutor was a man named Major Daniel Reeves, 38 years old, a Harvard-trained lawyer from Connecticut, calm under pressure, and personally chosen by Telford Taylor for this single hearing. The defense was led by Heinrich Klemper, a brilliant Berlin attorney who had defended German industrialists for 2 decades. Klemper's strategy was simple: discredit the ledger, argue that Russian capture violated chain of custody, argue that handwriting analysis was unreliable, argue that any document obtained by Soviet intelligence was inherently suspect. Reeves began at 9 in the morning. He laid the ledger on the evidence table. He opened it slowly. He read the first entry aloud in German, then in English. A Polish woman, age 42, executed by pistol shot, September 1939. He turned the page. He read the second entry. A Polish girl, age 14, same village, same day. He turned the page. A Polish boy, age 9, same village, same day. The courtroom went still. For 4 hours, Reeves read entries. He didn't argue. He didn't lecture. He just read. The judges, 3 British, 2 American, 1 French, and 1 Soviet, stopped taking notes. By the second hour, the courtroom audience was weeping silently. By the third hour, 2 German defense attorneys had to leave the room. By the fourth hour, even Klemper looked pale and stricken. When Reeves finished reading the entries documenting the execution of 7 American POWs near Malmedy in December 1944, he closed the ledger and spoke for the first time. "Your Honors, this book speaks for itself. The defense argues we should silence it on technicalities. We argue you cannot silence the dead." The bench recessed at 1 in the afternoon. The judges deliberated for 48 minutes. The ledger was admitted in its entirety as primary evidence. Klemper requested an emergency adjournment. It was denied. Within 24 hours, 3 SS defendants in unrelated Nuremberg cases changed their pleas from not guilty to guilty, hoping for reduced sentences before the ledger's full impact hit. 6 more confessions came in the following week. The American prosecution team gained access to 17 new witnesses, men who had previously been too frightened to speak, now willing to testify, because the ledger had broken the silence. Klaus Richter, hearing the news in his sealed Frankfurt cell, smashed his fist into a stone wall and broke 3 fingers. The wave that followed was unstoppable. The ruling traveled across Europe within 48 hours. By November 1, 1945, prosecutors in Poland, France, Belgium, Norway, and Yugoslavia had filed similar evidentiary motions in their own war crimes cases. Hundreds of investigations that had been stalled by procedural objections suddenly accelerated. The amnesty proposals that had been quietly circulating in Washington were withdrawn from consideration. Operation Paperclip continued, but its scope was sharply narrowed, and dozens of SS scientists who had been quietly approved for relocation to America were instead extradited to face trial. The numbers told the story. Before October 1945, only 158 SS war crimes prosecutions had reached trial across all Allied jurisdictions. Within 12 months after the Ledger ruling, that number passed 2,000. Conviction rates jumped from 61% to 88%. Sentences became markedly harsher. Death sentences for SS officers convicted of POW killings increased from 19% of cases to 44%. The American military adopted a new policy. Every captured SS officer above the rank of lieutenant would now be subject to mandatory investigation regardless of political considerations. The policy became known internally as the Frankfurt Standard. Officially, no one credited Patton. Privately, every officer in the European command knew where it had come from. German propaganda, even in defeat, attempted a counterattack. Underground SS networks began circulating a forged document claiming the Soviet ledger was a Russian fabrication. American intelligence traced the forgery to a printing press in Argentina within 6 weeks and arrested its operators. The forgery effort backfired catastrophically. It generated international news coverage that brought even more attention to the original ledger and the trials it was empowering. By December 1945, surrendering Wehrmacht and SS officers were begging American captors to be tried by Western tribunals rather than be released fearing assassination by their own former comrades. The fear inside the SS network had become so intense that fugitive war criminals began turning themselves in, hoping to receive lighter sentences in exchange for cooperation. The flood of confessions and testimony fed back into the Richter case, strengthening it beyond any defense. Klaus Richter went to trial in March 1946. He was charged with 206 counts of murder and war crimes. The trial lasted 9 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. He was found guilty on 194 counts. 12 charges were dismissed for insufficient evidence. He was sentenced to death by hanging. The execution was carried out on August 14, 1947. He was 26 months removed from the morning he had walked into Captain Mitchell's processing line wearing a necklace of 50 dead Americans. But the larger story, the story of what happened to the man who started it all, was just beginning. Because while Klaus Richter was being hanged in a German prison, General George S. Patton was already gone. Dead. Killed in a strange car accident on a quiet German road in December 1945, before the Ledger ruling had even produced its first wave of convictions, before he could see the system he had forced into existence transform post-war justice. The official story was simple: a traffic accident, a broken neck, a tragic end to a heroic life. The unofficial story was something else entirely. In Part 4, you will discover the chilling truth about Patton's final months, the enemies he had made, the warnings he ignored, and the secret investigation he was conducting in his last weeks of life. You will learn what happened to Captain James Mitchell, Lieutenant William Harper, and Mrs. Margaret Murphy of Boston. You will hear the final words Patton wrote about the dog tag case in a letter that was sealed for 60 years. And you will witness the moment decades later, when the last of the 50 American families finally received the answer they had been waiting for. The action is over. The reckoning is complete. But the story of those 50 dog tags has one final chapter that almost no one knows. April 1945 to August 1947. From a single SS captain wearing 50 stolen American dog tags in a Frankfurt processing center to a global reckoning that produced over 2,000 war crimes. Prosecutions transformed Allied legal procedure and exposed a Nazi network reaching into the highest levels of the Third Reich. Klaus Richter was hanged. The 50 families received their answers. The Frankfurt Standard became official military policy. The story should have ended there. A clean victory. Justice served, truth preserved. But the man who started it all, General George S. Patton, never lived to see the verdicts. He died in December 1945, 3 months after the Nuremberg Ledger ruling 4 months after the first dog tags were returned to grieving families in a car accident on a quiet German road that historians have argued about for 80 years. And the truth about his final months. The secret investigation he was running, the enemies he had made, and the letter he sealed before his death would not be fully understood until classified documents were released in 2007. The story of those 50 dog tags has one more chapter. And it is the strangest of them all. Because success sometimes comes with a price. George Smith Patton Jr. was 60 years old in the autumn of 1945. He had survived 2 world wars, 3 near-fatal accidents, and 1,000 combat decisions that should have killed him. He had liberated cities, crushed armies, and become the most famous American general of the war, more famous in Europe than Eisenhower himself. He should have gone home a hero. Instead, in October 1945, he was quietly removed from command of the Third Army and reassigned to a paper position overseeing historical records. The official reason was a press scandal. Patton had given an interview comparing the denazification process to American political party rivalries, an unfortunate metaphor that exploded across newspapers worldwide. The unofficial reason was deeper. Patton had been making enemies for months. He had publicly opposed the rapid release of low-ranking Nazi officials. He had personally protected the Richter investigation from political interference. He had written private letters to senators describing Operation Paperclip as a moral catastrophe. He had become, in the words of one classified memo, a problem requiring management. In November 1945, Patton began compiling his own private file on the dog tag case. He requested copies of all 50 family notification letters. He visited Captain James Mitchell, now serving an occupation duty, and personally thanked him. He wrote a sealed letter to Lieutenant William Harper, containing instructions to be opened only in the event of his death. The letter would not be opened until 1946. Its contents would not be declassified until 2007. And what it revealed about Patton's final concerns would change how historians understood the man entirely. On December 9, 1945, Patton's staff car was struck by an army truck on a road outside Mannheim. Patton suffered a severed spinal cord. He survived 12 days in a German hospital before dying of an embolism on December 21st. The accident was officially ruled the result of driver error. But 3 witnesses, who were never called to the official inquiry, later gave conflicting statements. The truck driver disappeared from American records within 6 months. The accident site was never properly photographed. Theories have multiplied for decades, ranging from simple tragedy to Soviet assassination to internal American conspiracy. What is certain is that Patton's last private notes, written in his hospital bed and recovered after his death, contained a single recurring phrase about the Richter case: "Make sure they are remembered." His subordinates kept that promise. But the deeper legacy of those 50 dog tags went far beyond the men whose names they bore. The legal precedent established at Nuremberg through the dog tag investigation became the foundation for every modern war crimes prosecution. The principle that battlefield trophy collection constituted evidence of intent, that physical objects could speak for the dead, that procedural barriers must yield to documented atrocity, would be cited in trials lasting into the 21st century. Cases against Bosnian war criminals in The Hague in the 1990s drew directly from the Frankfurt evidentiary standards. The International Criminal Court Charter, signed in 1998, included provisions traceable to lessons learned from the Richter Ledger. Even the prosecution of Saddam Hussein in 2005 invoked precedents established by Major Daniel Reeves in that 1945 Nuremberg courtroom. The numbers viewed across 80 years are extraordinary. Over 48,000 individual war crimes prosecutions worldwide between 1946 and 2024 have cited Frankfurt-derived legal standards. 27 nations have built their national war crime statutes on the foundations laid by that single case. The investigative model pioneered by Lieutenant Harper, cross-referencing physical evidence against unit records and witness testimony, became the template taught in military legal academies in 19 countries. Modern forensic investigation of mass graves in Rwanda, Cambodia, and Ukraine still follows the chain of custody procedures developed in that Frankfurt barracks. Civilian impact ran almost as deep. The American dog tag itself was redesigned in 1946 with new identifying marks that would make trophy collection harder and identification easier. The redesign saved an estimated 3,000 families from prolonged identification ordeals during the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Modern military identification technology, including DNA banking for service members, traces its policy roots to lessons drawn from the 50 Frankfurt tags. But the deepest lesson, the one Patton seemed to grasp better than anyone, was not about technology or law. It was about memory. The lesson at the heart of the dog tag story is something every generation must relearn. Evil is rarely loud. It is rarely obvious. It walks through processing lines wearing clean uniforms and calm expressions. It hides in collared shirts and political calculations. It survives by counting on the busyness of decent people, the procedural caution of bureaucrats, the fatigue of soldiers near the end of long wars. It survived the Holocaust because thousands of ordinary clerks did not look up from their paperwork. It nearly survived 1945 because a handful of officials calculated that justice was inconvenient. What stopped it that morning was not strategy or technology, it was attention. One man looked up. One general refused to look away. One captain failed to inspect a prisoner, and one general decided that failure was unacceptable. The chain reaction that followed 2,000 prosecutions, 80 years of legal precedent, the answers given to 50 grieving families, all of it traced back to a moment of pure attention. A man who saw something and refused to pretend he had not. History offers other examples. The young French officer who noticed irregularities in handwriting and reopened the Dreyfus case. The Soviet sergeant who recognized the truth at Babi Yar and survived to testify. The American photographer who insisted on documenting Dachau in detail when his superiors urged him to move on. Each of them was in some sense ordinary. None of them held the power to single-handedly correct an injustice. What they had was attention, and the willingness to act on what their attention revealed. The principle applies far beyond war. It applies to corporations that bury bad news, to communities that ignore predators, to institutions that protect their reputations at the expense of victims. The Frankfurt Morning teaches a lesson that translates from 1945 to 2026 without losing meaning. Look up. See what is in front of you. Refuse the comfort of looking away. And yet there is one final detail almost no one knows. When Patton's sealed 1945 letter to Lieutenant Harper was finally opened and declassified in 2007, it contained instructions, professional reflections, and a list of names. But it also contained something unexpected. A request. Patton had asked that one specific dog tag from the Frankfurt 50 never return to its family because no surviving relatives could be found, be preserved permanently. The tag belonged to Private First Class Samuel Goldberg of Brooklyn, New York. 20 years old. Killed in February 1945, almost certainly executed. No surviving family, no gravesite visited. Patton had written in his own hand that the tag should be kept until somebody comes for him. It was held in Army archives for 62 years. In 2009, after the declassification, a researcher tracing the case found a distant cousin of Samuel Goldberg living in Tel Aviv. She had been born in 1948 and had grown up hearing fragments of a family story about a great-uncle who had vanished in the European War. She flew to Washington in October 2009. The tag was placed in her hand by a serving Army officer in a small ceremony attended by 7 people. She wept for 40 minutes in a quiet government office. 64 years after Patton stopped walking in that Frankfurt processing center, the last of the 50 had finally come home. From a routine inspection on a spring morning to a global transformation of international justice. From one general's refusal to look away to 2,000 prosecutions and 80 years of precedent. From 50 stolen identities to 50 restored memories and one final reunion, 64 years in the making. George S. Patton showed the world that attention is the most radical act a powerful person can perform. That seeing what others refuse to see is the beginning of every meaningful justice. The total impact calculated across the decades is staggering. 48,000 prosecutions. 27 nations transformed. 3,000 families spared identification ordeals in later wars. An entire body of international humanitarian law shaped by lessons learned in a single Frankfurt barracks. Lives saved, futures protected, evil deterred, all of it traceable to the moment one man refused to walk past a Nazi captain wearing 50 American dog tags. If you know a similar story, a moment when one person's attention changed history, share it in the comments. There are hundreds of these stories from World War II and from every conflict since, ordinary people whose ordinary attention produced extraordinary justice. Subscribe to discover more of them. Hit the notification bell so the next reckoning finds its way to you. And remember the line Patton wrote in his hospital bed in those final days. 5 words that summarize the soul of the entire story, that connect the Frankfurt morning to the Tel Aviv reunion, that bind the dead to the living across 80 years and 3 generations. Make sure they are remembered, because in the end, that is the only justice the dead can receive. Not vengeance, not punishment, just the simple refusal of the living to forget. And as long as we remember, as long as one general's attention echoes forward, as long as one captain's failure becomes one investigator's mission, and one prosecutor's case, and one daughter's reunion, evil does not get the last word. Memory does. Attention does. And on a quiet April morning in 1945 in a processing center outside Frankfurt, that truth was set in motion forever.